Well, welcome to this lecture on bearing witness as we continue to trace our story throughout the New Testament. We have previously talked a bit about the Gospels and about the salvation that came in the life of Jesus and the good news that was there. And after his resurrection and ascension at the start of the book of Acts, he says this to his followers now. He says, "You will be my witnesses through the power of my Spirit to Judea and to Samaria and even into the ends of the earth." And so as the story of the New Testament continues, it now becomes the story of the disciples who will do something called bearing witness as they go forth into the world. And it'd be helpful to at least define what witness means, at least as how they would have heard it in those days when Jesus was giving those instructions. To be a witness of Jesus is to be someone whose life testifies to the worth and to the effect of following Jesus. So for me, bearing witness again in some of my times of my own faith journey would have meant that I was able to faithfully tell the story about Jesus, that he died on the cross and that he was resurrected and ascended into heaven. And I could tell you the truths about the story, but there was a deeper invitation for those disciples at that time. To bear witness was more than just telling a story about our faith. It was that you had a life that testified to the worth and effect of following Jesus. Because that really was his invitation at that time. It was some 93 times he said to people, "Follow me, follow me, and follow me." And Jesus wasn't alone in doing that in that time of the Mediterranean world. There were a lot of different rabbis or teachers of God's kingdom that took on disciples or took on followers. And Jesus was unique in that he wasn't calling out the best and the brightest. He was actually most often calling out those who had failed, fishermen who couldn't fish, or people who were corrupt like tax collectors, or zealots that were killing Roman officials. He basically collected a ragtag group of people and said, "You are to bear witness of my kingdom. Your life is to testify to the worth and effect of following me." And back in that time, if you had said yes to following Jesus, what you would have heard is you would have said, "I want to become just like my rabbi." We use the language of becoming Christ-like oftentimes, and that's what they would have heard. They would have wanted to become like Jesus. And specifically in that time, there were three ways in which if you decided to say yes to following a rabbi and bearing witness on behalf of that rabbi, there were three things that would have begun to take shape in you. You'd begin to think like your rabbi thought, you'd begin to wield the power and authority of your rabbi, and you'd begin to have the very character of your rabbi as well. So when Jesus is saying bear witness, he's expecting his disciples that over time, as they continue to follow, that they'll be able to think and wield the authority and the character of the rabbi. And taking each one of those in turn, starting with thinking, what we mean by that is not always having all of the robust or sophisticated theological arguments that might have come from some of our denominations or some of our faith, as important as those things are. To think like the rabbi is the ability to act and interact in any given situation with wisdom, the ability to see as God sees, so that you can see circumstances around you, you can see your relationships around you, you can see what you're confronted with in real time. And in the midst of that real time, you're able to bring light and hope and truth and love and needed language or compassion or whatever it happens to be. You're able to just see and think clearly and not be easily deceived. So to think like your rabbi is to consistently study under your rabbi to the point that you might see the power structures in the world around us. You might see what's going on in the news. You might see what's happening in a relationship around you. You might see what's happening in your workplace or in your church or with family. You're able to see with the kind of wisdom that's going to bring help and wholeness and compassion and healing or confrontation, whatever is needed in a specific time and space. We can't do that alone. It's why Jesus says that I promise to be with you even until the end of the age, and why he sends his Spirit to then help that process of learning and growing and thinking so you can act and interact in any given moment like your rabbi would. The second thing would be that you can wield the authority or the power of your rabbi. And there's part of that that's terribly unfamiliar to me, especially in Western culture. And the authority that Jesus wielded in the stories of the New Testament included things like healing people and raising people from the dead or casting out demons. Again, those are things that are not familiar to my faith journey, but I have many trusted friends of mine, both in the West and in African and Asian cultures as well, that know more about that kind of authority than I might. And clearly Jesus invited his disciples to do those things, and they did those things throughout the course of the stories of the book of Acts in particular, and into the Pauline letters as well. But authority comes in a different kind of way too, and it came in just simply the authority with which Jesus spoke. And that authority was often confusing to the people around him because he was the nondescript carpenter's son from Nazareth. And they wondered, nothing good can come out of Nazareth. And yet when Jesus spoke, they acknowledged an authority with which he spoke that didn't come from fancy letters or fancy degrees or the learnedness of academia, again, as important as those things might be. But God's authority comes from a different kind of place. It's an authority that only can come in partnership with the Spirit when you're able to say things that are just simply true. And with that comes an authority underneath it that the world often marvels at, and quite frankly, that kind of authority often upends the common wisdom of the world. That's why Paul says things like, the things that are foolish to men are wise in the eyes of God, or vice versa, flips it on its head. So the second thing that happens as we follow Jesus bearing witness is we begin to wield the kind of power and authority that Jesus wielded as well. And the third thing that is part of following our risen rabbi and Jesus is that we'll start developing the very kind of character that Jesus had from the inside out. And what I mean by character is in our unseen world of our heart, where our actual attitudes and dispositions and values are, things that are not necessarily seen by the world around us, but are true about us, that's what gets formed from the inside out, meaning that I don't want to be the kind of person who lives a hypocritical life, where hypocrisy is that what you see out here is just different than what's going on in here. And I know that journey all too well, to play maybe games of Christian pretend, acting faithful, but not necessarily feeling faithful from the inside out. And Jesus' beautiful invitation is that he, as the vine, as we abide in him, we begin to develop the kind of character that bears fruit into the outside world. And so the invitation, and maybe the most compelling people that I know that bear witness to the kingdom, whose lives testify to the worth of following Jesus, are the kind of people that if you could crack them open, you would see the same kind of love in their disposition, or the same kind of generosity, or the same kind of compassion that you're experiencing in the outside world. And Jesus promises his followers that kind of possibility, that over time and engagement with me, we can grow in a real Christ-like character so that we live this beautiful integrated life that the world begins to see and can even marvel at and say, you really are the real deal. When you love me, you really love me. When you cry for me, you really cry for me. This isn't a game, it's the real thing. And these are the kinds of things that happen when we follow our risen rabbi. And what we see in those early followers is that increasingly they are able to think like their risen rabbi. They were able to wield the power and authority of the risen rabbi, and they demonstrated the character of their rabbi that manifested themselves in the actions around them, thus having lives that testified to the worth and effect of following Jesus.